I've been a full frame camera user since 2015. For 9 years, I have exclusively owned only full frame cameras, until this past year with the launch of the G9 Mark II and the GH7. The reason I have these cameras is because Lumix sent them to me because I'm a huge Lumix fanboy if you've been around with the channel for a while. I love their cameras, and I was especially excited when they announced the LUMIX GH7 because it's basically the perfect camera and even has things that surprised me. Now that I've used it on a number of projects, I want to give you my thoughts on it as a full frame shooter, and first give you my top 3 big reasons why the GH7 is worth buying, but then also 3 reasons why I'd probably personally rather wait for the next full frame camera as a full frame shooter. Now, if you're new here and don't know me, my name's Dustin, your video tour guide, and remember to keep your arms and legs inside your chairs at all times. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. So let's jump right into the first reason why the GH7 is worth it. Just so you know, these aren't in any particular order because some of these reasons might be a bigger deal to some over others. So reason number 1 is being able to record ProRes RAW internally. Now for me, my everyday use case, this is not a big deal because personally, I just rarely shoot projects right now where it makes sense to shoot everything in ProRes RAW, or even RAW for that matter. But I understand the hassle of having to use an external monitor in order to unlock the ability to record RAW. I do it on my S5 IIX often and shoot in B-RAW. It's just really annoying and adds more weight and more inconvenience to the kit. Now, you still are probably going to want to record to an SSD if you decide to do this because those files will be massive, and an SSD is going to be much cheaper than a large capacity CF Express Type B card. But there is currently just not a ton of options in regards to cameras right now on the market at this price point that can record ProRes RAW internally. All right, let's move on to the next reason. This second reason is one I was initially very excited about, but after using it, it's not that I'm not excited about it, but I just understand that this is probably something that honestly just doesn't really apply to me, kind of like the first thing. And that is the firmware upgrade for the ARRI Log C3. I made a video about the workflow of using ARRI Log C3 on the GH7, and that video has actually been verified as the correct workflow by ARRI. Panasonic actually sent my video to them and they reached out and said I did a good job, so that's awesome. But after using it on a few shoots, I realized that there's really only 2 scenarios where it makes sense to use it, in my opinion. And if you don't plan on using it in those 2 scenarios, it doesn't really make sense. The first one though is the obvious reason, and that is if you're going to be using the GH7 next to an ARRI camera. I've shot some test footage against an ARRI Alexa and you will get some slight differences, but this is the closest thing you can get to getting ARRI-like looking footage. Plus, it'll simplify that post-production process since you won't have to do any kind of color transforms. And for those in the comments who say color transforms are the same, they're not. A color transform will be their, whatever transform you're using, it'll be their interpretation of what that log profile is. Whereas on the GH7, it is literally designed from the ground up on the sensor level of the GH7 to match the ARRI Log C3 color space. Like it is ARRI Log C3 on the GH7. And this is where the second scenario where it makes sense is if you want to use the ARRI LUTs specifically and just kind of get used to the ARRI Log workflow. ARRI has a ton of free LUTs you can download from their site and use with the GH7. I'll link the video that has all the links to these LUTs and the tutorial on how to use them properly. It's a little bit different than Vlog. Besides that though, I don't really see a big advantage to use ARRI Log C3 over Vlog, but those 2 scenarios are definitely reasons to consider the GH7. Or like I said, I guess if you want to just get used to the ARRI Log workflow. Let's move on to the last reason, and that is you have to use it in conjunction with the new XLR2 attachment. You can record 32-bit float audio internally, and not only will it be internal, but it'll also be synced with your footage. This is actually an industry first being able to do this. This is huge, especially for those who do like live events with speakers, wedding events, documentaries, or where audio can be a huge hassle to get the correct levels. I haven't personally used the XLR2, so I can't speak to my experience with it, but I know how huge this is. Even for just getting good Foley and sound effects on location, this is huge. But now let me talk about why, even with these amazing features on the GH7, I still tend to gravitate to my S5 IIX and any of my full frame Lumix cameras. The biggest reason is the low light. Now, to be fair, the low light on this camera, being Micro Four Thirds, is actually crazy. I might have to do a comparison against an APS-C camera just so you can understand that it can compete in the low light against any APS-C camera, no problem. But against full frame, it still just doesn't compete. And I understand that it's likely to never really compete just because of, well, physics. A full frame camera sensor is just going to capture a lot more light over a Micro Four Thirds sensor. But a lot of the time I'm shooting in very uncontrollable lighting scenarios, and I end up needing a camera that does well in low light more often than not. Now, I could probably put this next reason in the first reason because it does have to do somewhat with the low light capabilities, but it also doesn't. But it is the lack of dual native ISO. Using the full frame cameras I have as an example, the S5 II, S5 IIX, and the S9, and even in the past, the S1H, I'm used to being able to crank my ISO to 4000 and the noise and grain just cleans up very nicely. Whereas on the GH7, I felt like 4000 ISO was about the max I could go before the footage just doesn't really live up to my standards, I guess. I know you can do like noise reduction and all that stuff, but it also just could be because I'm just accustomed to being able to shoot at 4000 ISO and have very clean footage. And seeing 4000 ISO on the GH7 and it's pretty noisy makes me turned off by it. And so for me, I'll likely only use the GH7 in scenarios where I know it'll be very bright or I can control the lighting to work with it. And now the final reason has to do with the bokeh. Now I know, I'm a YouTuber. There was a huge trend for a long time online, especially in the YouTube space, where people obsessed about having extremely blurry backgrounds. For a while too, I even shot at the widest apertures because I suffered from the same bokeh bug, we'll call it. But over the years, I've become much more mindful on what my aperture is, and I try to choose an aperture that makes sense for what I'm shooting. Unless, of course, I'm shooting in low lighting conditions, then you kind of have to go with the widest option. With the GH7, I feel like I have much less control over what my background looks like because, as an example, I have the 12 to 35 f2.8 lens, which is the 24 to 70 millimeter equivalent on the GH7, but the background blur is not an equivalent even though it's an f2.8. And so on the GH7, f2.8 is actually f5.6 in regards to background blur. This just makes me feel like I have less control over what my background will look like because that's already approaching having a lot of your scene in focus. And I do understand you can get a lens that's like an f1.4 on the GH7 and you'll get an equivalent background blur, but I'm just so accustomed to not having to do that, it feels annoying. And I understand that the full frame Lumix cameras on the market have a similar inconvenience when it comes to shooting in slow motion, where it'll crop to S35. That's basically the only thing I'd like to see changed on future S-series cameras from Lumix. Maybe it's just something I'm so used to, it doesn't bother me as much. So in conclusion, do I recommend the GH7? Absolutely. You seriously cannot get a more perfect camera on the market right now that offers so much more that I didn't even talk about in this video. I mean, it literally offers pretty much everything you want except for internal NDs. That's like the only thing that this camera is basically missing. But if you think any or all of those reasons I mentioned would bother you like they bother me, and you prefer full frame, it might be worth waiting to see what Lumix has to offer next. I sure hope it comes soon, because I won't lie, I'm getting a little impatient. With all the other brands releasing these new cameras lately, it's not really enticing me to, to switch to a different system. It's just making me more excited to see what's next from Lumix. Because yeah, there's a lot of cool new things coming out from Lumix, and I'm completely happy, honestly, with the S5 II, S5 IIX, but there are scenarios where I'm hired for, maybe a bit more higher paying gig, and when you show up with this little guy, I could rig it up to make it look more professional, and honestly might start doing that if we don't get some kind of, S-series successor camera in the next, we'll say 6 months, maybe even like 3 months or so. It's the image. They're like, oh, I'm getting my money's worth, and it shouldn't be that way, but it feels like it is sometimes. So we'll see. If you're interested in anything Lumix, I'll have links in the description, which are affiliate links, so if you use those, thank you. It really helps me and the channel out. You can always support me though just by hitting the subscribe button and the bell button to be notified of future uploads. Till the next video though, happy filming.